My brother called me a loser in front of 40 people during my mother's 65th birthday dinner. My sister laughed, my cousins laughed, and even a few strangers sitting nearby joined in. While they were making jokes about my maintenance job, none of them realized they were standing inside a world they didn't understand. For nearly 7 years, I had quietly owned the commercial building where my brother's office operated, where my sister ran her marketing company, and where several businesses connected to my family earned their income. I never told anyone because I didn't think it mattered. But that night, while everyone took turns treating me like a disappointment, I realized something important. Sometimes the truth doesn't need to be defended. Sometimes it simply waits. And within 6 months, every person laughing at that table would discover exactly who I was. Because a single letter was about to change everything. My name is Daniel Mercer, and for most of my adult life, my family believed I was the least successful person among us. Looking back, I understand why they thought that. Every morning I left home wearing work boots, faded jeans, and a maintenance uniform. My days were spent fixing electrical issues, replacing damaged ceiling tiles, inspecting air conditioning systems, and responding to repair requests from tenants. Meanwhile, my older brother Victor drove luxury vehicles and spent his weekends talking about investments, business deals, and networking events. My younger sister Emily owned a marketing agency and constantly posted pictures from conferences and expensive restaurants. Compared to them, I looked ordinary. Compared to them, I looked like someone who had never accomplished anything. The funny thing about appearances is that people eventually stop questioning them. Once they decide who you are, they stop looking for evidence and start looking for confirmation. The birthday dinner took place at a restaurant overlooking the river. It was one of those places where everyone speaks a little more softly and pretends not to notice how expensive everything is. I arrived early, as usual, and immediately noticed Victor entertaining a group of guests near the bar. He spotted me the moment I entered and smiled in a way that told me exactly what kind of evening I was about to have. Victor always enjoyed being the center of attention, and over the years I had become one of his favorite sources of material. He walked over, looked me up and down, and asked if I had come straight from work. Several people laughed before I even answered. I smiled politely and said something vague. There was no point defending myself. The people laughing weren't interested in the truth. They were interested in the story they had already written about me. As the evening continued, conversations naturally drifted toward careers, promotions, investments, and achievements. Victor spoke confidently about expanding his company. Emily discussed new clients and future growth plans. Several relatives shared stories about vacations, business opportunities, and real estate investments. I mostly listened. Silence has a strange advantage. When people assume you have nothing important to say, they reveal things they normally wouldn't. By the time dessert arrived, I had already learned more about everyone's lives than they realized. Then came the speeches. Emily spoke first, followed by a few relatives. Eventually, Victor stood up, holding a glass of wine. The room immediately became quiet, because everyone knew Victor enjoyed an audience. He started by praising our mother and talking about how much she had sacrificed for the family. For a few minutes, his speech was surprisingly sincere. Then his eyes landed on me. The shift was almost immediate. He joked that our mother had taught all her children ambition and that most of us had listened. The room erupted with laughter. He followed that with a comment about how every family needed a cautionary tale and how I had generously volunteered for the role. More laughter followed. Even people who barely knew me joined in. I remember looking around the room and realizing something. Nobody there was reacting to who I actually was. They were reacting to a version of me they had created years ago. What nobody knew was that my grandfather had trusted me with something valuable. Years earlier, shortly before he passed away, he had quietly transferred ownership of one of his most important commercial properties into a trust. A few months later, that trust became mine. The building wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a skyscraper or a luxury development. It was simply a well-managed commercial property filled with offices, businesses, and long-term tenants. The kind of asset that produces income quietly and consistently. My grandfather used to tell me that truly valuable things rarely attract attention. He believed that people who constantly chase recognition often overlook real opportunities. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Years later, I understood perfectly. After dinner ended, everyone returned home believing they had just attended another family gathering. Victor believed he had entertained the room. Emily believed she had supported our mother. The relatives believed they had shared a pleasant evening together. Nobody realized that the event marked the beginning of a chain reaction that would eventually expose every assumption they had ever made about me. At the time, I didn't know exactly how things would unfold. I only knew one thing. The people who spent years measuring success through appearances were about to learn how unreliable appearances can be. The week after my mother's birthday dinner, life returned to normal. At least it appeared to. I woke up every morning, drove to work, completed maintenance requests, inspected properties, and handled the dozens of small issues that appear whenever people share commercial spaces. Most people assume maintenance work is simple, but it's actually a constant exercise in problem solving. Every day brings a new challenge, a new malfunction, or a new complaint. The reason I enjoyed it was because problems make sense. Pipes either leak or they don't. Electrical systems either work or they don't. Human beings are far more complicated. That's one of the reasons I preferred buildings to people. One Tuesday morning, I was reviewing maintenance schedules when I received a call from Martin Hayes. Martin managed the commercial property I owned through a professional management company. He had been handling operations for years and was one of the very few people who knew I was the actual owner. If someone rented office space in the building, they dealt with Martin. If a lease needed renewal, they dealt with Martin. If repairs were required, they dealt with Martin. My name almost never appeared anywhere. That arrangement suited me perfectly. I never wanted attention. I wanted stability. Martin didn't waste time with small talk. He told me one of the tenants had missed a payment. Normally that wouldn't be unusual. Businesses occasionally experience temporary cash flow issues. What caught my attention was the identity of the tenant. It was Victor's company. For several seconds I thought Martin must have made a mistake. Victor spent years projecting the image of success. He constantly talked about growth, expansion, and profitability. Missing rent payments didn't fit the story he presented to the world. Yet Martin assured me the information was accurate. Not only had Victor's company missed a payment, but they had requested additional time. As soon as I ended the call, I found myself thinking back to the birthday dinner. Victor's confidence suddenly looked less convincing. A few days later, Victor called me unexpectedly. We weren't particularly close, so unexpected phone calls always felt unusual. After a few minutes of awkward conversation, he finally revealed the reason for the call. He needed money. According to Victor, a client payment had been delayed, and his company was experiencing a temporary cash flow issue. He insisted the problem would be resolved quickly and promised to repay anything I lent him. Then he asked for $25,000. The amount surprised me, not because I couldn't afford it, but because the request revealed far more than Victor intended. Businesses don't suddenly need $25,000 because of one delayed invoice. Businesses need that kind of money when something deeper is wrong. I politely declined. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Victor wasn't accustomed to hearing the word no. For years, people had supported his ambitions, admired his confidence, and trusted his judgment. Now, for perhaps the first time in his life, reality was beginning to push back. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time thinking about what had happened. Part of me felt sorry for him. Another part remembered every joke, every comment, and every dismissive remark he had made over the years. Sympathy becomes complicated when it's directed towards someone who spent years underestimating you. A week later, Emily called. Unlike Victor, she sounded genuinely worried. She admitted she thought Victor was hiding financial problems. Several clients had left his company, expenses were rising, and he seemed increasingly desperate to secure new opportunities. She didn't know the details, but she could tell something wasn't right. During the conversation, she said something that stayed with me long after we hung up. She said she sometimes felt like everyone in the family was pretending. At the time, I wasn't entirely sure what she meant. Later, I realized she was talking about image. Everyone was performing a version of success. Some performances were simply more convincing than others. While Victor struggled to keep his business afloat, another development was taking place behind the scenes. The city had quietly approved plans for a massive redevelopment project. New transportation routes, commercial expansion, infrastructure improvements, and major investments were coming to the area. Most people hadn't heard about it yet, but those who understood real estate knew exactly what it meant. Property values would increase dramatically. The land beneath existing commercial buildings would become significantly more valuable. One afternoon, Martin called me with news that immediately captured my attention. A development company from Chicago wanted to buy the building. Not lease it, not invest in it, buy it outright. The offer was astonishing. It exceeded market value by a significant margin. At first, I assumed they were simply eager to acquire property before redevelopment plans became public. Then Martin explained something important. They weren't really interested in the building itself. They were interested in the land underneath it. Suddenly, everything made sense. The building sat directly inside one of the most promising redevelopment zones in the city. The moment the public learned about the project, competition would become intense. Investors, developers, and property groups would all begin searching for opportunities. What I didn't realize at the time was that Victor had already started paying attention to the same opportunity. A few weeks later, I accidentally overheard a conversation that changed everything. I was eating lunch at a small cafe downtown when I noticed Victor speaking with a man I didn't recognize. They were seated several tables away, but fragments of their conversation drifted across the room. Most of it was impossible to hear. Then Victor said something that immediately caught my attention. He mentioned securing ownership of a valuable property before redevelopment plans became public. The stranger nodded enthusiastically. Victor continued explaining how acquiring the property would change everything. He sounded excited, confident, certain. The only problem was that the property he was describing belonged to me. I sat there quietly, listening as Victor discussed strategies, investors, and future profits. It quickly became obvious that he had no idea who actually owned the building. He assumed it belonged to a holding company. He assumed ownership was hidden behind corporate paperwork. In some ways, he was right. Ownership was hidden, just not in the way he imagined. As I listened, I realized something uncomfortable. Victor wasn't simply interested in the redevelopment opportunity. He was depending on it. His financial future appeared tied to acquiring a property he could never legally obtain. The more he spoke, the clearer the situation became. He wasn't making plans. He was making bets. That realization stayed with me for days. For years, my family had judged success based on appearances, expensive suits, luxury cars, impressive conversations, public confidence. Yet the person everyone admired was building his future on assumptions, while the person everyone dismissed already possessed the asset he desperately wanted. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so tragic. What worried me wasn't that Victor wanted the property. What worried me was how far he seemed willing to go in order to get it. And unfortunately, I was about to find out. For the next several weeks, I kept my distance and watched events unfold. One advantage of being underestimated is that people rarely see you as a threat. They speak freely around you. They reveal information they would normally protect. They assume you're too insignificant to matter. Victor had spent years treating me that way, and now that habit was working against him. The more confident he became, the more careless he became. The more careless he became, the more information he revealed. Every conversation, every rumor, and every piece of gossip pointed toward the same conclusion. Victor was placing enormous financial bets on a future he didn't control. One Monday morning, Martin called again. His voice immediately told me something was wrong. He explained that Victor's company had missed another payment. Not only that, but there were reports that several investors had recently become involved with a new venture Victor was promoting. According to Martin, Victor had been telling people he had access to a property that would dramatically increase in value once redevelopment plans became public. The moment Martin said those words, I knew exactly which property Victor was talking about. Mine. The strange thing was that Victor genuinely seemed convinced he could somehow acquire it. He wasn't lying to investors because he thought he would fail. He was lying because he believed he would eventually succeed. The more I thought about it, the more dangerous the situation became. Investors are willing to forgive mistakes. What they don't forgive is misinformation. If Victor had convinced people to invest money based on promises he couldn't fulfill, he was heading toward disaster. I considered calling him. I considered warning him. I even considered revealing the truth. But every time I imagined the conversation, I reached the same conclusion. Victor wouldn't listen. People rarely listen when information threatens their ego. Instead, they search for reasons to dismiss it. If I told him I owned the property, He would assume I was exaggerating or lying. The only thing powerful enough to change Victor's mind was reality. A few days later, reality began knocking on his door. Emily called again and asked if we could meet. We sat in a quiet coffee shop near her office. The moment she arrived, I could see how stressed she was. She looked exhausted. Not physically exhausted, but emotionally drained. She explained that Victor had become obsessed with the redevelopment project. He talked about it constantly. He believed it would solve every financial problem he faced. According to Emily, he had borrowed money, promised returns to investors, and built an entire future around one opportunity. Listening to her, I felt a growing sense of concern. Confidence can be useful. Ambition can be powerful. But obsession is dangerous. Obsession convinces people to ignore warning signs. As we talked, Emily asked a question that caught me off guard. She asked whether I thought Victor was actually successful. At first, I didn't know how to answer. Success means different things to different people. Some measure it through money. Others measure it through status or influence. Eventually, I told her the truth. I said that truly successful people rarely spend much time convincing others of their success. They simply focus on creating value. Emily sat quietly for several seconds after hearing that. Then she admitted something I never expected. She said she sometimes envied me. The statement surprised me so much that I laughed. She shook her head and explained. According to her, I seemed comfortable. Not wealthy, not powerful, just comfortable. I wasn't constantly trying to impress anyone. I wasn't competing. I wasn't chasing approval. For the first time, I realized Emily had been paying more attention than I thought. A month later, the city officially announced the redevelopment project. News outlets covered it immediately. Property values surged almost overnight. Investors rushed into the area. Commercial brokers began discussing opportunities. Developers started making offers. The moment the news became public, my phone started ringing. Acquisition groups wanted meetings. Investors wanted information. Property consultants wanted conversations. Suddenly, everyone was interested in the same asset they had ignored for years. Martin spent most of his days responding to inquiries. Every offer was larger than the last. It quickly became obvious that the building was worth significantly more than anyone had anticipated. While the property's value increased, Victor's situation deteriorated. The same news that created opportunities for me created pressure for him. Investors expected results. Lenders expected progress. Promises suddenly required evidence. One evening, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. When I answered, the voice on the other end introduced himself as one of Victor's investors. He didn't realize who I was. He assumed I was simply another business contact. During the conversation, he casually mentioned Victor's confidence regarding the property acquisition. The investor seemed convinced everything was under control. As I listened, I felt a knot forming in my stomach. The situation had moved beyond optimism. It had entered dangerous territory. A week later, Martin called with information that changed everything. Someone had submitted documents related to a proposed acquisition of the building. That wasn't unusual by itself. What made the situation alarming was the content of the documents. According to Martin, the paperwork suggested the buyers already possessed certain rights connected to the property. Rights that didn't exist. Rights that couldn't exist. The moment Martin described the details, I knew Victor was involved. He had crossed a line. Whether intentionally or not, he had created a situation that could lead to serious legal consequences. For years, Victor believed confidence could solve every problem. Unfortunately, paperwork doesn't care about confidence. That night, I sat alone in my living room thinking about everything that had happened. I thought about the birthday dinner. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about the years I spent allowing people to underestimate me. Most importantly, I thought about what would happen next. Deep down, I knew the truth could no longer remain hidden. Too many people were involved. Too much money was involved. Eventually, someone would need answers. And when those answers arrived, my family would be forced to confront a reality they had spent years ignoring. The only question remaining was how painful that realization would be. 3 days later, Victor called me. The moment I heard his voice, I knew something had happened. The confidence was gone. The arrogance was gone. For the first time in my life, my older brother sounded afraid. Victor asked if we could meet in person. That alone told me how serious the situation had become. My brother loved phone calls because they allowed him to control conversations. He loved meetings when he was confident, but when Victor specifically requested a private conversation and refused to discuss details over the phone, it meant one thing. Something had gone very wrong. We agreed to meet at a small diner on the edge of town. It wasn't the kind of place Victor normally visited. There were no luxury cars in the parking lot and no executives discussing business deals over expensive lunches. It was quiet, simple, and mostly empty. When I arrived, Victor was already sitting in a corner booth. The moment I saw him, I knew things were worse than I imagined. His suit looked wrinkled. His eyes were tired. The confidence he carried for most of his life seemed to have disappeared completely. For years, Victor had looked like someone in control. Sitting across from him that afternoon, he looked like someone desperately trying to hold everything together. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. A waitress brought coffee and left. Victor stared at the table. Finally, he exhaled and said the words I never expected to hear from him. He admitted he had made a mistake. Not a small mistake. Not a temporary setback. A real mistake. According to Victor, investors were demanding answers. Lenders were asking questions. Documents were being reviewed. Lawyers had become involved. Every problem he thought he could solve with confidence was now demanding proof. And proof was the one thing he couldn't provide. As he talked, I realized something surprising. Victor wasn't trying to impress me anymore. He wasn't exaggerating. He wasn't performing. For perhaps the first time in his life, he was being completely honest. He explained how the redevelopment project had seemed like the perfect opportunity. At first, he believed he could negotiate a deal. Then he convinced himself he could secure financing. Then he convinced himself investors would support him. Each step felt reasonable on its own. The problem was that every step depended on an assumption. Eventually, those assumptions became the foundation of an entire business strategy, and now that foundation was collapsing beneath him. After nearly 20 minutes of explanation, Victor finally asked the question he had been avoiding. He asked if I knew who owned the building. The moment he said it, I felt a strange sense of calm. For months, maybe years, everything had been moving toward this moment. Every joke, every assumption, every misunderstanding, every conversation. Somehow they all led here, to a small diner, to two brothers sitting across from each other, to a question neither of us could avoid anymore. I looked directly at him and told him I knew exactly who owned the building. For the first time all afternoon, hope appeared in his eyes. He immediately leaned forward and asked if I could introduce him. He spoke quickly, explaining how important the situation was. According to him, a conversation could change everything. A meeting could save deals. A simple introduction might solve his problems. Listening to him, I realized he still didn't understand what was happening. He thought the solution was somewhere outside the room. He thought success was one conversation away. He thought someone else held the power to fix his mistakes. Then I told him he didn't need an introduction. The confusion on his face was immediate. He asked what I meant. I repeated myself, slowly, clearly. Then I explained that he didn't need an introduction because he was already speaking to the owner. For several seconds, he simply stared at me. It was as if his brain refused to process the information. I could almost see him searching for alternative explanations. A joke, a misunderstanding, a mistake, anything except the truth. When none of those explanations appeared, reality finally reached him. The look on his face is something I will never forget. It wasn't anger, not at first. It was shock, pure shock. For years, Victor had built an entire image of who I was. That image had survived family gatherings, birthdays, holidays, and countless conversations. In a matter of seconds, that image shattered. He asked how it was possible. He asked why nobody knew. He asked why I never told anyone. I answered honestly. Nobody asked. That answer frustrated him more than anything else, because deep down, he knew it was true. The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour. Victor wanted details. He wanted timelines. He wanted explanations. Eventually, I told him about our grandfather. I explained how the property had been placed into a trust and transferred years earlier. I explained why I kept ownership private. Most importantly, I explained that the building had never been a secret. The information existed in public records. The reason nobody knew was because nobody ever looked. Everyone had accepted the story they preferred. The successful brother, the ambitious sister, the maintenance worker. Once people believed those labels, they stopped searching for anything deeper. At one point, Victor asked the question that mattered most. He asked why our grandfather chose me. The room became very quiet after that, because beneath all the business problems, legal issues, and financial complications, that was the real wound. Victor wasn't upset about the property itself. He was upset about what the property represented. Trust, responsibility, confidence, validation, things he spent his entire life chasing. I told him the truth. Our grandfather trusted me because he believed I would protect the asset instead of exploiting it. He believed I would think long-term. He believed I would prioritize stability over appearances. The moment I finished speaking, Victor looked away. Neither of us needed to say anything else. When we finally left the diner, it felt like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. For years, my family had treated me like an afterthought. Now the truth existed in the open, and there was no way to put it back. The next few days were chaos. Victor told our mother. Our mother told Emily. Emily told relatives. Phone calls started arriving constantly. Text messages appeared at all hours. People who hadn't shown interest in my life for years suddenly wanted conversations. Everyone wanted answers. Everyone wanted explanations. And everyone wanted to know the same thing. Why didn't you tell us? The truth was simple. For years, nobody cared enough to ask. Unfortunately, the hardest conversation was still ahead of me. Because eventually my mother called and asked everyone to come to her house. She wanted the entire family together. She said we needed to talk. The moment I hung up the phone, I knew exactly what was coming. For the first time in years, my family wasn't gathering to celebrate a birthday or a holiday. They were gathering to confront the truth. The family meeting was scheduled for Sunday evening, and the moment I pulled into my mother's driveway, I knew this wasn't going to be a normal gathering. Every parking space was occupied, and through the front windows I could see relatives standing in small groups, speaking quietly. There was no laughter, no music, and none of the relaxed energy that usually surrounded family events. Instead, there was tension. The kind of tension that appears when people know a difficult conversation is unavoidable. When I walked through the front door, every conversation stopped instantly. Heads turned toward me, and for the first time in years, I felt like everyone in the room actually saw me. The irony wasn't lost on me. For most of my adult life, I had been practically invisible at family gatherings. People greeted me politely, exchanged a few words, and quickly returned to conversations they considered more important. Now, suddenly, everyone was interested. Not because I had changed, but because their understanding of me had changed. My mother was sitting in the living room waiting. She looked exhausted in a way I had never seen before. Not physically tired, but emotionally worn down. The confident woman who had spent decades holding our family together seemed uncertain for the first time. She stood as I entered and asked me to sit down. The room became completely silent. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then my mother finally asked the question everyone had come there to hear answered. She wanted to know why I never told anyone about the building. It was a fair question. In fact, it was probably the question I would have asked if our positions had been reversed. I looked around the room before answering. Victor sat near the fireplace staring at the floor. Emily looked nervous. Several relatives couldn't even maintain eye contact. After a long pause, I gave the only honest answer I had. I told them that nobody ever asked. The silence that followed felt different from any silence I had experienced before. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't disbelief. It was recognition. Every person in that room understood exactly what I meant. For years, they had assumed they knew everything important about my life. They knew my job title. They knew what kind of truck I drove. They knew where I worked. But they never asked deeper questions. They never showed real curiosity. They saw the surface and decided the surface was enough. My mother eventually said that I could have told them. I agreed. Of course I could have. Then she asked why I didn't. I thought carefully before answering because the truth wasn't simple. Eventually, I asked a question of my own. I asked whether it would have mattered. The room became quiet again because everyone understood the point. If I had announced years earlier that I owned a valuable commercial property, people would have treated me differently immediately. Not because I had changed, but because their perception of me would have changed. That realization seemed to affect everyone in the room more than anything else I said that evening. Emily was the first person to break the silence. She admitted she had been wrong. She said she believed she understood me, when in reality she barely knew me at all. As she spoke, I could see genuine regret in her face. She wasn't apologizing because of money or property. She was apologizing because she realized she had spent years making assumptions about someone she never really tried to understand. My mother listened quietly before finally speaking again. She asked when she had lost me. The question surprised me because I didn't think she had lost me at all. After thinking about it for a moment, I told her the truth. I explained that she never stopped seeing me entirely. She simply started seeing the version of me that everyone else created. Somewhere along the way, the opinions, assumptions, and expectations of other people became stronger than her own understanding of who I actually was. When I said that, tears appeared in her eyes almost immediately. The conversation continued for hours. Old memories surfaced. Misunderstandings were discussed. Stories were shared. For the first time in years, nobody was performing. Nobody was trying to impress anyone. Nobody was competing. People were simply being honest. Then something happened that I never expected. Victor stood up and admitted he owed me an apology. The room became silent again because everyone knew how unusual that was. Victor had spent most of his life projecting confidence and certainty. Admitting fault wasn't something he did. Yet there he was, standing in front of our family, openly acknowledging that he had spent years treating me unfairly. He admitted that he looked down on me. He admitted that he judged me. Most surprisingly, he admitted that he had been jealous. At first, the statement sounded ridiculous. Why would someone who appeared successful be jealous of the brother he constantly mocked? But the more he explained, the more it made sense. He confessed that while he spent years chasing approval, status, and recognition, I seemed comfortable with who I was. I wasn't constantly trying to prove anything. I wasn't competing. I wasn't performing. And deep down, that bothered him more than he realized. By the time the meeting ended, nothing had been magically fixed. Years of assumptions don't disappear in a single evening. But something important had changed. For the first time in a very long time, everyone was looking at reality instead of appearances. And although the truth can be uncomfortable, it has one advantage over assumptions. Once you finally see it, you can't unsee it. Over the next few weeks, life settled into an unusual rhythm. The family meeting didn't magically solve years of misunderstanding, but it changed something important. For the first time in a very long time, people stopped making assumptions and started asking questions. My mother called more often. Emily stopped treating our conversations like obligations and started treating them like opportunities to actually know me. Even Victor changed, although his transformation was slower. Pride doesn't disappear overnight. It fades gradually, usually after reality forces a person to confront things they've spent years avoiding. While my family worked through their own emotions, the redevelopment project continued moving forward at an incredible pace. Property values kept rising. Investors became increasingly aggressive. Every week brought another acquisition offer, and every offer seemed larger than the one before it. Martin spent most of his time managing inquiries, reviewing proposals, and filtering serious buyers from opportunists. One afternoon, he called me and explained that several development groups were now competing directly against each other. The competition had become intense. According to Martin, the property was no longer simply valuable. It had become strategic. Whoever controlled the land would have influence over a major section of the redevelopment corridor. Hearing him describe the situation felt surreal. For years, the building quietly generated income while attracting very little attention. Now it seemed like everyone wanted it. Around the same time, Victor's legal and financial problems finally reached a turning point. The investors he had attracted weren't interested in excuses anymore. They wanted answers. Some demanded meetings. Others demanded documentation. A few threatened legal action. The pressure was enormous. For the first time in his life, Victor couldn't talk his way out of a situation. Confidence wasn't enough. Charm wasn't enough. Networking wasn't enough. He needed accountability. Strangely enough, that ended up being the best thing that could have happened to him. People often imagine growth comes from success, but most meaningful growth comes from failure. Success tends to reinforce existing behavior. Failure forces reflection. One evening, Victor called and asked if I wanted to have dinner. The invitation surprised me. For most of our lives, our interactions revolved around family events. We almost never spent time together voluntarily. Curiosity convinced me to accept. We met at a small restaurant downtown, and the conversation felt completely different from anything we had shared before. Victor didn't talk about business deals. He didn't talk about investors. He didn't talk about future opportunities. Instead, he talked about mistakes. He admitted that much of his life had been built around proving something. Proving he was successful, proving he was intelligent, proving he deserved admiration. The strange thing was that he couldn't even remember when that need started. At some point, the pursuit of approval had become automatic. He wasn't chasing success because he enjoyed it. He was chasing success because he didn't know how to stop. As I listened, I realized something important. The version of Victor I had disliked for years wasn't entirely real. It was partially a performance, a role he had been playing for so long that even he started believing it. That realization didn't erase the past, but it helped me understand it. Understanding doesn't automatically create forgiveness, but it often creates perspective. For the first time in our lives, we spoke honestly. Not as competitors, not as opposites, just as two brothers trying to make sense of their lives. Several months later, the redevelopment project reached a major milestone. The city officially approved the next phase of construction, and property values increased again. Shortly afterward, Martin brought me an offer unlike anything we had seen before. A development consortium wanted to purchase a controlling interest in the property while allowing me to retain a minority ownership stake. The proposal included enough money to guarantee financial security for the rest of my life. More importantly, it preserved long-term involvement in the project. From a business perspective, it was exactly the type of deal my grandfather would have appreciated. Practical, strategic, sustainable. I spent several weeks evaluating the proposal. The financial aspects were easy to understand. The emotional aspects were more complicated. Selling even part of the property felt like closing a chapter of my life. That building represented more than an asset. It represented trust. It represented responsibility. It represented a relationship with my grandfather that continued long after he was gone. Eventually, I realized something. Protecting his legacy didn't require preserving everything exactly as it was. Sometimes, protecting a legacy means allowing it to evolve. The day I signed the agreement, I thought about the birthday dinner. I thought about the laughter. I thought about the assumptions. I thought about all the years spent allowing people to underestimate me. If someone had told me then how everything would unfold, I probably wouldn't have believed them. Yet here I was, making one of the most important decisions of my life with complete confidence. Not because I had something to prove, because I didn't. The money changed certain practical aspects of my life, but not as dramatically as people expected. I still wore work boots. I still enjoyed solving problems. I still preferred practical conversations over impressive ones. The biggest difference wasn't financial. It was psychological. For the first time in my life, I felt completely free from other people's expectations. I no longer cared whether anyone considered me successful. I no longer cared whether people understood my choices. That kind of freedom is difficult to describe until you've experienced it. Once you stop performing for an audience, life becomes much quieter and much more enjoyable. Looking back now, I realize the building was never really the point of the story. The property created the conflict, but it wasn't the lesson. The lesson was much simpler. People see what they expect to see. They judge based on appearances. They create narratives. Then they mistake those narratives for reality. My family wasn't unique. Everyone does it. The difference is that sometimes life creates situations where those assumptions are exposed. And when that happens, people are forced to decide whether they're willing to accept the truth. Thankfully, my family did. Not immediately, not perfectly, but eventually. And that made all the difference. Over the following year, life changed in ways none of us expected. The redevelopment project transformed the entire district, and areas that had once seemed ordinary suddenly became some of the most valuable commercial property in the city. New businesses moved in, construction projects appeared everywhere, and investors continued competing for opportunities. Every time I drove through the neighborhood, I found myself thinking about my grandfather. Years before anyone else recognized the area's potential, he had quietly invested in it because he understood something most people never do. Real value often exists long before the rest of the world notices it. People tend to chase trends, but truly successful people learn how to recognize opportunities before they become obvious. While the city changed, my family changed too. The transformation wasn't dramatic or immediate. There were no grand speeches, no miraculous reconciliations, and no sudden moments where everything became perfect. Real relationships don't work that way. Instead, trust returned gradually through small conversations, honest moments, and a willingness to acknowledge mistakes. My mother began calling me regularly, not because she needed something, but because she genuinely wanted to talk. Sometimes we'd spend an hour discussing family matters. Other times we'd talk about work, current events, or completely ordinary things. What mattered wasn't the subject. What mattered was the fact that she was finally getting to know me instead of relying on assumptions. One afternoon, while we sat together drinking coffee at her kitchen table, she admitted something that stayed with me for a long time. She told me she had spent years worrying about my future because she didn't understand the life I had chosen. Looking back, she realized she had measured success using the same standards everyone else used. She compared incomes, careers, achievements, and appearances without ever considering that different people want different things from life. Victor wanted recognition. Emily wanted growth. I wanted stability, independence, and peace. None of those goals were inherently better than the others. They were simply different. Hearing her finally understand that felt like a burden being lifted from both of us. For years, we had been speaking different languages without realizing it. Now, for the first time, we actually understood one another. Emily changed as well. The constant pressure she placed on herself slowly began to disappear. For years, she had measured her value through productivity and achievement. Every accomplishment immediately became a stepping stone toward another goal. Every success created a new expectation. Watching everything that happened within our family forced her to reconsider that approach. She started taking time for herself, setting healthier boundaries, and focusing on relationships she had neglected while chasing professional success. During one conversation, she admitted that the entire situation had taught her how dangerous assumptions can be. For years, she believed happiness came from achievement because that was what everyone around her seemed to believe. Then she realized that one of the happiest people she knew had been quietly living his life without seeking anyone's approval. The person who changed the most, however, was Victor. His legal and financial problems eventually stabilized, and while the experience cost him a great deal, it also gave him something he had never possessed before: perspective. For most of his life, Victor had chased success because he believed it would solve every problem. He thought more money would create security. He thought more recognition would create confidence. He thought more achievements would create happiness. Instead, he discovered that none of those things matter if they are built on insecurity. The collapse of his plans forced him to confront realities he had spent years avoiding. It was painful. It was embarrassing, but it was also necessary. Nearly 18 months after my mother's birthday dinner, Victor invited me to attend a charity event his company was sponsoring. Normally, I would have declined, but something about the invitation felt sincere. When I arrived, I noticed immediately that he was different. He wasn't dominating conversations. He wasn't exaggerating stories. He wasn't trying to impress everyone in the room. Instead, he was listening, asking thoughtful questions, paying attention to other people. It sounds simple, but for someone like Victor, it represented a complete transformation. At one point during the evening, he introduced me to several business owners. For years, introductions like that would have included a joke at my expense or some comment designed to elevate himself. This time, he simply smiled and told them I was one of the smartest businessmen he had ever met. The compliment caught me completely off guard, not because of what he said, but because I knew how difficult it was for him to say it. When our eyes met a few seconds later, he smiled and admitted it had taken him far too long to realize it. That moment meant more to me than any apology ever could. As time passed, the building slowly became less important. People stopped talking about ownership, redevelopment, and investment opportunities. Life moved on. New challenges appeared. New memories replaced old ones. Eventually, the property became just another part of my life, rather than the defining chapter of it. Looking back now, I realize the building was never really the point of the story. It created the conflict, but it wasn't the lesson. The lesson was much simpler. People often see what they expect to see instead of what's actually there. They make assumptions, create narratives, and then treat those narratives as reality. My family wasn't unique in that regard. Everyone does it. The difference is that sometimes life creates situations where those assumptions are exposed. When that happens, people are forced to choose between protecting their pride and accepting the truth. Thankfully, My family chose the truth. Not immediately, not perfectly, but eventually. And that's what made all the difference. Today, if you met me, you probably wouldn't guess any of this happened. You'd see a man wearing work boots, driving an ordinary truck, and living a fairly normal life. In many ways, you'd be right. My life is ordinary. The difference is that I no longer care how it appears from the outside. Years ago, I spent a lot of time wondering why people misunderstood me. Now I don't. Because I've learned that the people who truly care about you eventually take the time to understand who you are. And the people who don't care were never really paying attention in the first place. Once you understand that, life becomes simpler, quieter, and far more peaceful than you ever imagined possible. A few months after the redevelopment deal closed, I found myself standing on the roof of the building just before sunset. It had become a habit of mine over the years. Whenever I needed to think, I would come up there and look across the city. From that height, everything seemed simpler. Traffic became distant noise. Deadlines became less important. Problems felt smaller. As I stood there watching the skyline, I couldn't help thinking about how strange the last few years had been. If someone had told me that a family dinner would eventually change the course of my relationships, my finances, and even the way I viewed myself, I would have laughed. At the time, it felt like just another uncomfortable evening. Looking back, I realize it was the beginning of everything. One of the biggest surprises wasn't how much my family changed. It was how much I changed. For years, I told myself I didn't care what people thought about me. I convinced myself that being underestimated didn't bother me. The truth was more complicated. Even when you know other people's opinions are wrong, hearing those opinions repeatedly still affects you. It creates doubts. It creates questions. It creates moments where you wonder if maybe they're seeing something you don't. The family meeting forced me to confront that reality. For the first time, I realized I had spent years allowing other people to define parts of my identity. Once I understood that, I stopped giving those opinions power. Around that same time, Martin invited me to lunch. We hadn't seen each other much since the redevelopment deal closed, and I figured he simply wanted to catch up. Instead, he surprised me with a question. He asked if I had any regrets. At first, I assumed he meant the business deal. Maybe he thought I regretted not selling sooner or not holding longer. But he shook his head and clarified. He wanted to know whether I regretted keeping the building a secret for so many years. The question caught me off guard because it was something I had asked myself many times. For a moment, I considered giving an easy answer. Then I decided to be honest. I told him I didn't regret keeping the secret. What I regretted was staying silent for other reasons. There were moments when I should have defended myself. Moments when I should have challenged assumptions. Moments when I should have spoken up instead of simply walking away. Martin listened carefully before saying something I still think about today. He told me that silence is powerful, but only when it's a choice. When silence comes from confidence, it's strength. When silence comes from fear, it's surrender. The distinction seemed obvious after he said it, yet I had never considered it before. For years I thought I was choosing silence. In reality, some of that silence came from wanting to avoid conflict. Understanding the difference helped me more than I expected. A few weeks later, my mother invited everyone over for dinner. Unlike the family gathering that had changed everything, this one felt completely normal. People arrived carrying food. Children ran through the house. Conversations overlapped. Laughter filled the rooms. Nothing about the evening felt forced. At one point, I found myself standing in the kitchen watching everyone interact. Victor was helping set the table. Emily was arguing playfully with a cousin. My mother was smiling in a way I hadn't seen for years. For the first time in a long time, nobody seemed concerned about status, success, or appearances. People were simply enjoying each other's company. As I stood there, my mother walked over and quietly asked what I was thinking about. I looked around the room before answering. I told her I was thinking about how close we came to losing all of this. She followed my gaze and nodded slowly. Then she said something that perfectly captured everything we had been through. She told me families don't usually fall apart because of one big event. They fall apart because of hundreds of small misunderstandings that go unaddressed for years. The more I thought about it, the more I realized she was right. Nobody in our family intentionally created distance. Nobody woke up one morning and decided to stop understanding each other. It happened gradually, assumption by assumption, comment by comment, year by year. That realization became one of the most important lessons of my life. Most relationships don't fail dramatically. They fail quietly. People stop asking questions. They stop listening. They stop being curious about one another. Eventually, they replace understanding with assumptions. Once that happens, every interaction gets filtered through a version of reality that may not even be true. My family spent years interacting with a version of me that existed mostly in their imaginations. The moment they finally met the real person, everything changed. Today, whenever someone asks me what I learned from all of this, I give them the same answer. I tell them that success isn't nearly as visible as people think. Some of the wealthiest people I've met look ordinary. Some of the happiest people I've met live simple lives. Some of the strongest people I've met never receive recognition. The world encourages us to judge based on appearances because appearances are easy. Understanding people requires effort. It requires curiosity. It requires patience. Most importantly, it requires humility. The moment you think you already know everything about someone is usually the moment you stop learning who they really are. And that's why this story was never really about a building. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about real estate. It wasn't even about family conflict. At its core, this story was about perception. It was about the danger of assumptions and the power of truth. Because sometimes the person everyone overlooks is carrying responsibilities nobody sees. Sometimes the quietest person in the room knows more than anyone realizes. And sometimes the people we think we understand are complete strangers until we finally take the time to listen. If there's one thing I hope people take away from my experience, it's this. Never assume you know someone's story based on what you can see. The most important chapters are often the ones nobody talks about. And the people who appear ordinary on the surface may be carrying extraordinary lives beneath it. I learned that lesson because my family underestimated me for years. Fortunately, they learned it too. And in the end, that mattered far more than any building ever could.